Hello everyone, today we start our branch of medieval Bosnia for our historical regional series, starting from, in fact, the very beginning and appreciating the intricate characteristics of this land's complex history. Everything starts in the 6th century, right? I made a video about the Slavic migration in the Balkans. If you're interested, we have to talk more about the Western and the Eastern Slavic migrations, but we have somehow profiled already, for example, also in greater detail in another video, the Serbian migration. Here we're looking slightly before that. As you know, the Slavs came into different groups, very often sort of way more fragmented than basically anything that the main Germanic blocks, like settling, especially in southwestern Europe, had done. We are, by the way, in a moment in which the same empire attracts single groups within its imperial boundaries. In the 6th century, we have the Justinian reconquest, for example, and during this period, 527-565, the Western Balkans were fully reclaimed from the so-called barbarians. In other words, the Roman Empire of Justinian managed to be re-extended over most of, especially the central Mediterranean, part of the western one. The barbarians we're talking about here were actually the same heavily Romanized Ostrogoths of Theodoric that was no more at this point, de facto triggering in his succession the premises for the Gothic War that would have, in fact, brought to the reconquest of Italy, where the Goths had been settled by the same Constantinople, right? And all this area of essentially the Balkan coastline around on the Adriatic, its hinterland, belonged to Gothic Italy that reached as north as the Danube, at that point de facto the boundary with Germany, because that was not considered as Germany yet, at least on the right bank in particular. And there is all a plethora of populations, especially from the continental side of the Dinaric Alps, that somehow revolved as satellites and subjects around the Gothic court of Ravenna. These places had historically been quite strategic, yet the Byzantines had issues with, in fact, the Germanic settlement originally that had brought, for example, the early Dervingian Goths to be created literally as a unified people, as essentially the army of Illyricum. The same Goths had been Ostrogoths, the Greuthungians, or at least what was remolded of them after the Hunnic invasions, were pushed to Italy, but they still maintained a degree of control on the Western Balkans. There were the Gepids, north of the Danube, that contended with the Byzantines and the Goths. This very important strategic centers, such as Singidunum, Naissus, etc. These are mostly today's Serbia. Around the same time of Justinian, the Sclaveni, so the Slavs, conducted raids across this region, in part as a consequence just of the post-reconquest exhaustion. You know that there is a plague that bears the name of Justinian by the era that somehow creates a lot of crises and voids from an economical, demographic point of view that allow the Slavs to settle, especially in this Balkan hinterland territory, including the one that would become Bosnia. Naturally, local populations, Romanized, Germanized, etc., are still there, right? The Balkan hinterland at a point had historically been Illyrian, Celtic, right? And other groups had also just infiltrated. But the Slavs come in these territories that are actually Latinized, right? If you look at Serbo-Croatian, but it's something we point often out from a linguistic point of view, it's actually rich in Latin vocabularies, right? The Greek world essentially stopped at the Balkan mountains, right? The entire Danubian plain historically was more Latinized, as also the presence of the Vlachs and later Romanians as a nation exemplifies. This is naturally a very deep frontier, and especially when we look at the mountains that overlook the Adriatic Sea from the Balkan side, you realize it was very difficult, even just for a powerful empire like the Byzantine one, to simply as directly control these territories. This would be true at some point even during the time of Ottoman occupation, right? There are some islands like Montenegro, for example, amidst the other territories that remain somehow perfectly isolated. They can't quite be reached. In other words, it's not like these big empires lacked the absolute means to curb these populations. The point is that whether they were left more or less autonomous, it didn't really matter too much. Besides, the Byzantines at this point are starting to have really lots of issues with the same Slavs, by the way, that in spite of their political fragmentation, basically invest the Balkans as a tidal wave that penetrates up to the Peloponnese, reaching even North Africa through boats, etc., witnessing to the basically uncontrolled settlement of these people, that, by the way, were even in this sense accepted by the empire as new manpower, labor force, because some of them would end up becoming Byzantine subjects and or depending on the urban markets of Byzantine civilization, even from these hinterland valleys. When we look at, as long as basically they wouldn't create some specifically outlined political powers of, if anything, provincial scale, they were not much of a problem, and or they could simply bribe, they could be subjugated also with forts, etc. But when we look at the northwestern Balkans, we're looking at a sort of even more isolated dimension. This is not just across the Balkans, but it's also up mountain in quite impervious areas. We've seen this well with the Serbians, right? We are going to make also more videos about medieval Serbia. I also made some videos about properly Western Balkan warfare between the 11th and the 14th century. So actually today we will look up until the beginning of the 12th. So that is somehow fitting. And in there we talk Bosnia in part as well. This is the first video made uniquely about Bosnia. And naturally, let's hope this to be the beginning of a longer series. Now, the 6th century Bestoan bishopric with several episcopal centers under the Salonitan archdiocese, that is the Dalmatian one, is referenced at this point, indicating early ecclesiastical organization in what would become Bosnia. Obviously, these areas were Christian, right? They were at least Christianized. As you know, I make lots of videos about the migration here, explaining a bit also the spread of Christianity is not much a geographical thing as much as properly a political and social thing as well. I will not even just digress on this. I will just point out that while we do not have specific information of, for example, a specific bishopric at this point, for example, overseeing Christian parishes along the Bosnia River Valley, there would have been this de facto still late antique reality, surely the possibility of this being the case. I mean, before the waves that would sort of abate themselves in the 6th and the 7th, especially century, on the Byzantine Empire that will shrink and also bring to some further decadence with the plague and everything, we can imagine a similar system, right, of also a live ecclesiastical administration being quite well standing and also surviving even through the later centuries, even though we do not have a specific evidence for that, an explicit one. This is basically the leitmotif of this video. We don't actually have too much documentary evidence. By the early 9th century, historical sources, though scarce and often focused on neighboring polities that were developing by a greater scale, suggest that northern and northeastern Bosnia was captured by the Carolingian Franks and remained under their control until the 1870s. This is quite relevant as far as what we've seen also for the Pannonian Slavs, in part even the Serbs, right, further southeast. That is to say, after the collapse of the Avar Khaganate, the Carolingian Franks had actually the upper hand, were the stronger power, even compared to the Eastern First Bulgarian Empire that also made a video on it that routinely tried to infest this other Balkan countries, but not being quite successful in retaining control of them, even though it was closer. Right, of course, the Franks were more powerful. This does not mean, however, that Bosnia was directly controlled by the Franks either. I mean, we're sure some Carolingian paladin will have arrived in Bosnia at some point. There was a lot of warfare, by the way, going around between the same, in part like some quieter war between, I don't know, Frankish and Bulgar hunting parties or some kind of other confrontation. The same was for the local Slavs that naturally did not want other foreigners in general to be involved in their affairs. Accomplished, of course, also a tough Bosnian terrain that allowed for that kind of withdrawal up mountain by these rough shepherds that could eventually come to plunder again the valleys and gradually re-seizing control. Naturally, there was at this point already, we will see now how Bosnia was born in a political sense, but I mean, what would make that was already the local establishment, the local aristocracy, peasantry, etc. If the term castra oikoumena in the De Administrando Imperio, famous Byzantine source, essentially providing with an encyclopedical overview of what was controlled by the Byzantines by the 10th century, refers to ecclesiastical centers rather than inhabited towns. This is fascinating because it's almost like an Irish kind of situation where even if Christianity had not necessarily spread in probably a pre-urban society like the Bosnian one, right? Also, during Roman times, these areas hadn't been particularly developed or urbanized. And so you had mostly ecclesiastical centers embodying probably beacons of civilization in these areas. The Administrando Imperio speak of two such centers in Bosnia that may be respectively Bistua, possibly that is Bistua, possibly Zenica or Vitez, and Martar, likely Konjic. This is important because we don't fully, know whether these towns actually match the specific ecclesiastical centers are discussed here because of the different name at the time. Remember, here it's a Byzantine filter of these Slavic realities on the ground, so to say. The presence of these centers, however, indicates that Bosnia was considered already an enucleated territory, if anything, before 822. In Bosnia, there are some very interesting archaeological finds about, in Futak, for example, that date, if anything, to either Ostrogothic or Longobarд times, but we think before these people's migration into the Italian peninsula. At this point, these territories were controlled either, as you understand here, by ideally the Byzantines, but mostly the Slavs. But the latter, of course, chose a Latin script to uniform to what was the dominant language in the area historically, even when into this kind of Byzantine world, right? Of course, what was going on, essentially down the Danube, because if you follow the Danubian Valley, you arrive not quite in Bosnia, but in definitely the Danubian Valley watershed territories that, as we've seen, the Franks, or at this point, had basically invested pretty far south, possibly roughly around Singidunum, those places, with today's Belgrade. So there was a specific connection between the Slavic elites in Bosnia and the Carolingian Empire, to the point of the Franks conceiving properly this world as their own, this sort of Ostsiedlung conceivably Germanized, or at least Germanically dominated at this point, in these Slavs, the sort of the usual, in fact, Slavic neighbors from the other side. We shall really talk much more about the Ostsiedlung as a whole in the southeast, because we made lots of videos about different polities, Styria, Carinthia, the Pannonian Slavs, and more. But we've never seen this in a fully comprehensive way, and the deep influence that the Germans, from one side, and the Italians also from the other, had on these territories. In fact, I recently made a video about medieval Serbia, where I think Serbian followers of us asked me to also highlight more, perhaps in dedicated videos, probably this dual influence on, in that case, Serbia, but you understand by extension also Bosnia. The semi-mythical chronicle of the priest of Duklja, that is dating to the later Middle Ages, we're in the 13th, 14th century, primarily in its Slavic redaction, lists early legendary rulers of Transmontana, Zagorska Sklavinia. All right, this is incredibly important, starting with Silimir, Bladin, and Ratimir. So these are chieftains. The latter died in 838. That are followed eventually in the account by four other unnamed rulers, which makes it possible for these to have properly ruled Bosnia at the time. The Drina Valley, as you know, is quite sort of inland. Of course, when you look at the Duklians, were more from the side of the Adriatic, they, of course, would have seen this as Transmontana, so beyond the mountain, the Dinaric Alps, which is possibly... let's not enter the philological complexities of this later Slavic accounts and how they, later medieval Slavic accounts, and how they looked at this past eras, also being aware of other sources that had been written about them at the time. However, according to the same priest of Duklja, Satimir ruled from approximately 860 to 877. The Annales Ragusini, that is to say the ones of Ragusa / Dubrovnik, and I made a video about this medieval maritime republic on the Adriatic, the annals cover essentially 14th to 17th century. So there are also substantially later sources record that in 871 the death of the childless Stepan led to a 17-year war, which concluded with Croatian ruler Bereslav's conquest of Bosnia. I made a video about the Duchy of Croatia, if you're interested in that. Like, it obviously addresses also this attempted Croat expansion into probably the Bosnian highlands, which doesn't end too well, at least as we will see now that there's a lot of influence there, and Croatia was a stronger power. But we're talking also fairly extended territories in pretty rough terrain, and so given that we're looking at still nascent what would become national states already mostly by the later Middle Ages, you realize that this conglomeration also, we look at Croatia, Bosnia, Serbia, there is an important level of ethno-linguistical continuity in origin. And so more than anything, the emergence of these polities is mostly the measure of, say, the local scale of power, and so the capacity of the local chieftains to maintain sort of their own autonomy from one another. From 877 to 917, the priest of Duklja names Budimir as ruler, followed by Ban Svetolik Stepan from 917 to his death in 932 or 34. This local Slavic ruler, Svetolik Stepan, reportedly fled to the Magyars in Hungary after Bosnia was conquered once again by the Croatian king Krešimir I, or Michael Krešimir II. We don't exactly know which one this was. Nevertheless, the connection with the Croats is also obvious in as much as these elites would have married into one another. So we're looking at essentially Bosnian leaders that try, as we've seen, to escape from a Croatian control and or conditions of power sharing that were tilting in Croatian favor. Kresimir's son Stjepan, Stephen Držislav, and his descendants are said to have governed White Croatia and Bosnia. So a sum of these territories. In 926, Croatian King Tomislav reincorporated parts of western and northern Bosnia after having partially lost eventually control on that and clashing with the Bulgarians, famously enough in the Bosnian highlands. There was also an important battle fought at that point. This, if you look at the video about the Duchy of Croatia, you realize we're probably the easternmost frontier of Croatian power. So one that could be barely controlled, especially with the Bulgarians trying to infiltrate and at some point surely making leverage on the Bosnian chieftains, at least in part against the Croatians. Other Bosnian chieftains would have been compliant with the Croats. They would have sort of understood the broader advantages deriving from cooptation and gradual, in fact, subsumption into this bigger picture. But this was still a particularly autonomous land. The Catholic cult was pretty darn intense historically among the peoples that had inhabited these areas before the Slavic arrival. As we were saying before, the Goths, the Gepids, the Longobards were literally obsessed with this. Apparently the Gepids, even the Gepidic, properly angelic iconography, heavily informed, say, Byzantine and Longobard Michaelic culture and representation. We will talk more about St. Michael because there is really a pan-European subconscious about this. Think about Mont Saint-Michel, the Abbey of St. Michael in the Susa Valley, the sanctuary dedicated to the saint in the Gargano Peninsula. So, by the way, also gradually closer even to places like Croatia or Bosnia historically. This connection is quite fascinating. In the late 9th and early 10th centuries, Latin priests from Dalmatian coastal towns were the primary responsible for the large Christianization of Bosnia. Right. In other words, of course, the more civilized parts of the region on the Adriatic, the more Romanized areas, had also been Slavicized to a degree, as we've seen in the video about Ragusa Dubrovnik, and that were also in connection with, yes, Italy, the Pope, as we've seen here. Consider that here we are before the schism between the East and the West, but there is some importantly distinct kind of feeling and identity within the Church, depending on the Greek and the Latin legacy. Naturally, we're, again, in an incredibly primitive ancestral time. By the way, in the late 9th, early 10th centuries, we are in the darkest moment of the Magyar invasions in the area, the collapse of the Carolingian Empire. Some Byzantine comeback, but also they're actually mitigated by these events. So it's obvious that some Bosnian communities would have remained untouched by Christianization. Right, we can't say, again, geographically that, I don't know, entire swathes of Bosnia, or even smaller ones, were specifically unchristian, right? Most people in Bosnia would have kind of been Christian, but holding beliefs that were not considered particularly in line with that as well, and that was completely fine and normal for the times and places, right? It's just by saying that, of course, a full sort of Bosnian civilization was only very gradually taking off, which is, again, completely normal for the times and places. We have no evidence of this, but I think it's pretty obvious that by the 9th century, the Roman papacy would have dispatched Latin missionaries to the Bosna River Valley, establishing churches in rural settlements. Rome was quite active and made a video about, in fact, the Rome of Charles III in slightly before this period. And we've seen how not much really too bad really happened to these places and how they were quite active and quite tied to Croatia and surely, again, having their influence on Bosnia through these missionary activities. It was just really the temper of the times going toward that direction in challenging especially the Byzantines that were actually to lose ground and the broader, in fact, battle for the evangelization of Europe. Around the same period, Petar of Serbia expanded into Pagania. That was one of the coastal areas of Dalmatia in the hands of some Slavs that would be essentially resisting Christianization for a particularly large amount of time, where other neighbors wouldn't. And this invasion brings to, in fact, the same Serbs were basically attacking them, not just because of that, but because as pirates, basically this inhabitants of Pagania were sort of the least constructive neighbors, let's put it in this way. And in the process, the Serbian ruler came into conflict with Michael of Zachlumia. That was one of these other territories. In areas now encompassing Eastern Herzegovina and Montenegro, semi-independent entities emerged under Serbian influence that was mounting up, as we've recently seen in some episode about that land. By the way, the reason why I'm talking about these coastal areas is that, of course, they were deeply connected with Bosnia, right? They were literally the bridge that, as we've seen, was crossed by those missionaries that connected with Dalmatia. So that's why it's relevant. The Serbian control over these polities would have unavoidably connected Bosnia with the Adriatic through the same Serbs that naturally also ruled mostly from a continental dimension, even though very much attached to the Dinaric Alps, just like the Bosnians. Of course, the Balkan hinterland, right, the Dinaric Alps, the mountaineers of the Balkan hinterland would historically sell their goods to the Adriatic markets, right, of the Balkans, and in this sense opening to a broader influence. As you understand here, paradoxically, something closer to Italy than to Constantinople in a broader sense. Of course, the Byzantines do have an important control over the Adriatic at this point, but there are also the Slavic pirates and connections with the, in hindsight, more thriving Italian peninsula. In particular, these agreements between Petar of Serbia and the Bosnian merchants facilitate the exchange of salt and grain across the Drina River, which evidently speak not just of an Adriatic trade, but specifically a continental one, probably directly between Bosnia and Serbia. The De Administrando Imperio, that, again, it's a 10th century source, provides the earliest documented mention of a Bosnian entity proper. Describing Bosnia, so this is spelled Bosona, right, in Greek, as a, quote, small little land or a small country, Horion Bosona in particular, situated within the Serbian principality. In other words, the Byzantine emperor, author of this, like at the court of Constantinople, properly describing the world in their encyclopedical and universal vision of the same. Situated Bosnia probably within the Serbian domination, so again, overlapping, as we've seen here, Croatia, Serbia, in between, along the upper reaches of the Bosna River, that recurs ever more as the heartland of Bosnia. The De Administrando Imperio notes that Bosnia included two populated towns, Katara and Desnik, because the source basically says, okay, there is this people, there is this country, and these are the most important cities of sort. We've seen it also for the issue of Great Moravia, that people think it's like in Slovakia, and it was possibly instead in Serbia, right? At least with a connection with the former, but the Greater Moravia especially being possibly very much a Serbian one. Now, going back on the Bosnian reference, Katara was at some point believed to be near Sarajevo or Kotorac, but archaeological evidence contradicts this and suggests instead that Katara may be located near the present-day Kotor Varosh, with potential sites at Bodbac or Bobos, though these have only yielded late medieval artifacts. So again, we don't know, but there is not an overwhelming, that Bosnia went through pretty nasty issues historically throughout all its history. And so you can't even expect, of course, archaeological or historiographical efforts to be overwhelmingly funded, uniform, sort of internationally revised, etc. I had the opportunity, for example, in my university at some point to work with some, I will not say which nationality from the Balkans, they were nice people, telling the truth, but I mean, their historiographical method was terrible, as a matter of fact, and it was an exchange doctoral activity. But they studied in our university, but I mean, there were certain things that were objectively unpresentable. So all the respect to, in this case, they were not Bosnians, by the way, but you understand, of course, we talked this at different times in our videos about the medieval Balkans, because, of course, the quality of history yielded is lower just because of a shortage of documentation. And therefore, as you understand in these videos about the Balkans, especially the earliest era, are just guessing about whether a name means that place or, there is not much else. 2010 excavation report from the Bosnian Institute of Archaeology, however, notes that the discovery of 10th century pottery at Bobac suggests earlier settlement activity than previously thought. This, of course, can be said about many settlements. These places would have seen sometimes younger settlements. And it matters, of course, what we mean by settlement, which degree of development. Of course, human continuity would have always been there, but it's complicated to reconstruct the entire picture. The location of Desnik remains instead unknown from the administrative period, though it was once linked to Deshani. There is, however, some general perplexity about the administrative period claim to begin with. In fact, when you look at the Greek preposition used, this is often translated as in, whereas it can be interpreted also as toward. I will not enter sort of the medieval Greek and Greek in general grammar issues because they're overwhelmingly complicated, or at least, as you know, if you have studied ancient Greek, you know that one preposition can mean 3,000 things at a time. It's part of the overloaded Indo-European semantics. But to make the long story short, it is possible that the placement of these towns would have been not, basically in Bosnia, but in Serbia. So but not because, as we've seen, this means in, but rather toward, in fact, Bosnia. So this would have been Serbian towns, but toward the Bosnian frontier. There is, however, a counter-argument to this, that is to say, why, given that in the administrative period there is a list of polities, there would be a need to basically detach these lands from the Serbian account, right? This is important because the administrative periods we've seen would be the first source to properly describe with certainty a de facto Bosnian polity separated from Serbia, as it would remain for most of its history. Now, it's probable that Bosnia, by the way, was at this point more under Croatian than Serbian influence, as we've seen before, and even part, as we've seen, however, still as a detached land, according to the sources from properly Croatia, White Croatia. It's rather the mid-10th century that witnesses Bosnia's fall into the Serbian sphere of influence. In 949, a civil war in Croatia had, in fact, enabled Tomislav to extend his control over Bosnia. Hence, the such councils held there. The Annales Ragusini records that in 972, a Bosnian ruler was killed and the land was seized by the Lord Duke of Albania, which complicates things. Again, the Annales Ragusini are fairly later, and we're not entering even here. We're not going to fuel further the Balkan feud. As anytime I upload videos of this kind, at least this was more the case in the previous years. There is this, greater activity, more views, and more people eventually attacking each other in the comments for different ethnic issues. But you can understand why in perspective. However, another ruler from the lineage of Moravia de Harbati, so this would be some Croatians still, however, related to the previous Bosnian ruler, expelled, according to the story of the Annales, this duke, and essentially unified Bosnia. It's interesting that there is the term Moravia thrown in again, but I'm not going to discuss the philology of the Annales Ragusini, whatever they really meant with that. This would have been an age in which actually the Western and Southern Slavs would have been already separated by the Magyar settlement. Maybe there was some broader memory of the aforementioned greater Moravia in Serbia, but why attaching it to Croatia? And so, again, we're not going to play that game anyway. Also because the Croatians at this point didn't have to do with, say, Slovakia or places like that. Important is, if anything, the Croatian connection, which was claimed by this local Bosnian ruler, by the way. So it shows the aforementioned infiltration of the Croats, the marriages of between these elites, etc. After Chaslav's death in the 1940s or 60s, Bosnia may have been reclaimed by Michael Krešimir II of Croatia, or achieved political independence of some sort. This fine, it's a bit of a word, but let's say by medieval standards in the second half of the 10th century, what is independent really? Nobody's independent from anything ever, even just in today's world. But let's say at least as a standalone country was consolidating in the midst of this other neighbors. It's believed that Bulgaria and its re-expansion during these generations, in fact, briefly dominated Bosnia at the turn of the 10th century, followed by a period of Byzantine rule as the empire had been quickly re-expanding towards the northwestern axis. A 990 Bulgarian chronicle from Preslav notes Tsar Simeon's brief occupation of Bosnian territories, establishing garrisons along the Drina River, which makes a lot of sense because we've seen the Bosnians lived in this highland and even higher mountains, with the Drina representing the sort of flat land, at least the main river around that mostly sloped southeast towards Serbia, and so mostly creating some sort of defensive belt against Bosnia, while indeed, like as we've seen often also in ancient history, like a fortified limes, so to say, does not mean that there is simply a protection from the external. There is an actual power strategic projection. And as we've seen, the Bulgarians had arrived up to the Bosnian highlands to clash with the Croats over its control. The Bulgarian Empire also has a fleeting, say, strategic reach, right? They're not so more courageously present like the local Slavs, of course, nor as even the more powerful Carolingians at some point. At this point were no more, but they were at least as a broader Western civilization were to spur some more stable power, unlike in the Eastern Balkans. A 992 military dispatch from Sofia confirms Simeon's appointment of a governor to oversee Bosnian garrisons near the Drina River, by the way, ensuring control over local trade routes. And during the reign of Samuel, we are in this Samuel of Bulgaria is 997-1014. The ruler moved freely through Bosnia and Serbia, apparently, likely capturing them. Naturally, he was moving with an army, though further evidence is absent, and so we don't understand exactly what was going on. And of course, temporarily, the Bosnians may have supported the passage of an army, maybe in contributing to its supplies. Others would have just resisted attacking, harassing the enemy supply lines. And we have to imagine, of course, always multiple parties, as we've seen in the better documented Serbia and Croatia, that are incredibly messed up in this sense, with an enormous instability connected with the sort of the political fragmentation of the various clans, this external forces from others, and always interfering with one another. A 1002 record from the monastery of St. Catherine of Sinai mentions Samuel's campaign through Bosnia, collecting tribute from local chieftains near Visoko. A 1003 inscription from a church in Vrandok documents the same Samuel's donation of silver to local clergy, securing their loyalty during this Bosnian campaign. That was evidently not just a random action, because you don't donate precious metal to a land that you don't somehow conceive as your own and or where you want to concentrate further power. Admittedly, here we are a bit at the peak of the First Bulgarian Empire, so This is not really a random moment. Like the First Bulgarian Empire was de facto the largest power in terms of Bosnian proximity, and so this much would make sense. In the early 11th century, Bosnia was, however, also temporarily part of the state of Duklja. It's well possible that at this point in time, the Byzantines were making pressure on the Bosnians to, for example, attend specific meetings in Constantinople, forcing them to acknowledge Basil II's authority. Unfortunately, we don't know much about this, but we can imagine sort of letters between, I don't know, the Patriarch of Constantinople and the Bishop of Duklja meeting some properly naming some Bosnian delegates attending particular even councils, right? Confirming sort of some Bosnian participation, cooptation in Byzantine political and even religious proceedings. As we will see now, however, this was essentially the greatest reach the Byzantines ever had on these territories, unless we take some periods under Manuel Comnenus, but at least in an attentively sort of in fact, Comnenian era, as you know, was very oligarchic and privatized, and so were more statile in administrative fashion from the time of Basil II. Not too much time away between each other, but still quite meaningful for how these eras would develop. In 1042, according to the Annals of the Bishops of Duklja, Lutovid of Zaklumia, an unnamed ban of Bosnia, and an unnamed Župan of Raška, that is Serbia, as we've seen in our videos, accepted Byzantine gifts of silver and gold to aid Michael Anastasia against Stefan Vojislav at the Battle of Bar. These are various leaders that were battling, in fact, over the control of the region, also with that under pressure of the Byzantines, and we're told that there is a band of Bosnia already participating in this clash. We can imagine, of course, money paid to Bosnian leaders by the Byzantines to secure his alliance with Stefan Vojislav, that was being backed by Constantinople. Now, following the East-West Schism of 1054, it was not to be historically definitive, but it would end up being, the newly formed Roman Catholic Diocese of Bosnia came under the authority of the Archbishop of Split, with its jurisdiction shifting among the latter C. 1060, 1182, Bar, 1089 to 1100, and in 1199, and Dubrovnik / Ragusa, 1102, 1124, 1153. This is quite relevant because, as it's clear, there was an intense Western influence on Bosnia. There would have been, at some point in the mid-11th century, some papal issue confirming the transfer of the Bosnian diocese to Split's jurisdiction, citing its strategic importance in the region. In the mid-11th century, diocese's civitas was recognized probably as Bosna, likely centered in Visoko, one of the 19 bishopric civitates within the Kingdom of Croatia and Dalmatia, right, in terms of ecclesiastical administration, according at least to the Provinciale Vetus. We are in the late 12th century, but refer to this other time. Therefore, just like in Croatia, Bosnia witnessed to the domination of Latin Rite Christianity. This is at least the case for western, northern, and central Bosnia, so the majority of the land. While indeed Orthodox faith did exist, again, at this point, it's, as you know, this division by the 11th century doesn't mean too much. We're mostly looking at different cultural spheres of influence rather than actual theological divides, especially for what the Bosnians were specifically concerned. In the eastern regions near Serbia, that in fact remain aligned with Constantinople, and the river Drina. Right? Remember that at this time, the papacy had not just successfully Christianized the Croats, which happened very early in time, but at some point, not much now, but in previous centuries, the same Bulgarians had toyed with the idea of basically being ecclesiastically controlled by Rome and not by Constantinople. Eventually they stuck to the latter, but they also got destroyed by this point. So we have surely some indications of this. The annals of Duklja record that Constantine Bodin conquered Bosnia and appointed his first cousin Stephen, 1084-1095, in this guise, as Duke of Bosnia, who participated in the siege of Dubrovnik as well, though the account contains definitely lots of inconsistencies and chronological problems, just like for that type of sources that, again, is always problematic and relatively unreliable. We can imagine the Byzantines essentially ruling from Dyrrhachium were aware of Stephen's role in the siege of Dubrovnik, noting his leadership of Bosnian troops under Bodin's command, as well as likely the presence of Bosnian forces during the siege. We can make more videos about medieval. We've seen it already in part, some medieval arms and armor in Bosnia, and we'll come back on that because of course, they're similar to the broader Western Balkan situation, but here we can imagine mostly lighter troops of some kind, archers, the retinues of this heavily armored knights by the sort of 11th century Balkan vibe that was naturally influenced by a mix of cultures, primarily Byzantine, but mostly reflecting the poverty of the Balkan hinterland. So surely the Bosnians would have had an important role even in the assault to the city. Unfortunately, we don't know precisely any of this, and historiography focuses on the neighboring regions, leading to the conclusion that while the land of Bosnia was a political reality at the time, and the documented existence of a Bosnian bishopric provides sufficient evidence for this, as we said before, the written sources offer little insight into its rulers or social developments in the 10th to 11th centuries. There is not, by the way, just Bosnia that eventually made it into a historical region of the Balkans, but for example, of a certain importance, but for example, Hum as well. And the obvious reason is that Bosnia was mostly a cluster of Slavic chieftains at this point, rather than a single principality that at least we can explicitly document as such. It would have existed. We can't think that is the case. However, what this mostly also tells us in the international scene is that Bosnia would have at this point been mostly subject to other rulers, right? So, yes, there was a local leadership, but as we've seen also in the history of the Serbs, the Croats, the Bulgars, the Byzantines, the Duklani, etc., if you're ruled, say, as a part, as we've seen, of Croatia, or something attached to Croatia, yeah, there is somebody there that is a ruler, but if you're not, I don't know, someone's ruler, but if you're not recognized much as such, it means that you also don't count as much, right? And so the establishment would have been basically in the hands of the local elite with this external influences. If anything, Bosnia is probably emerging also thanks to the fact that it's in a pretty central location, in a pretty sheltered location in the Balkan setting, so that it mostly owes its inoculation to the shortcomings of its neighbors that could not quite directly control it or could basically use proxy policy and strategy to continuously snatch or at least separate the land from each other in the process. This, however, does not mean, in fact, that Bosnia was simply part of some other state, right? It's difficult to speak of a Bosnian state in the sense that the level of development of 11th, 12th century Bosnia would have been pretty scarce, but a bit like in the broader area. So there is no exception here. It's not like, since Bosnia is weaker and we don't have specifically an evidence, that means that in absolute terms it wasn't there as a polity or even as some sort of nascent state. It's only by the early 12th century that the earliest reliable records of Bosnia emerge, right? And there are hypotheses about this too. For example, we find the title of King of Rama bestowed, adopted mostly by Bela II, King of Hungary, in 1135. The Magyars had this kilometric list of titles because their dominion was more akin to an empire, and most of these places they didn't actually even directly control. But Hungary, for example, is a big power in the area, will keep growing, and this term Rama is possibly referred to Bosnia. Bela II named his son Ladislaus II as Duke of Bosnia, however, literally Bosnensem Ducatum, referring to the polity, which is quite evocative and formally official at this point of the rise of Bosnia as an actual state that evidently would have already, in order to be considered by the Hungarians for the hereditary princes, etc., was evidently a fully developed entity and distinguished one. With presumed Hungarian conquest and influence, the Banate of Bosnia at this point emerges, where by the mid-12th century, the first properly expressed and known by name Bosnian ban is Boris, 1154-1163 in reign. We can, by the way, imagine rulers like these to actually have attended a royal assembly at the Hungarian court during this period, where he would have been, negotiating for the grant of additional lands near the Urbas River in exchange of his loyalty. And so compacting further this Bosnian dominion. After the Battle of Sirmium, that was the high point of Byzantine power in this part of the Balkan hinterland, where here in the Byzantine-Hungarian War of 1165-1167, the final treaty acknowledged Bosnia as part of Hungarian dominion taken by the Byzantines. Right, so it temporarily, this was really a very high point of the Komnenian power. It had involved Serbia, as we've seen, was relatively not passive to this. It was actually involved in the war, but not from a condition of great power. Bosnia would have also lived this more passively. There were titles used by Manuel I Komnenos, such as Dalmaticos, Ugricos, Bosnikos, Krobatikos, etc., evidently indicating in Bosnikos the Bosnian polity. There is also a panegyric by Michael Anchialos stating that the Croats and Bosnians should be enrolled in the tables of the Romans. The clash extended for a broader amount of time, we're talking 13 years, beyond the formal hostilities and or other specific broader campaigns and operations. After this, the Hungarians actually retook basically what was north of the Balkans from the Byzantines, and therefore also Bosnia fell once again under Hungarian broader Hungarian dominion. Nevertheless, it was also growing at this point. There was a rampant growth all over Europe, and you have Ban Kulin ruling between 1180 and 1204, quite important years. What was, in practice, a fully fledged polity a de facto independent one, at least provided with large autonomy, that was nevertheless obviously very much challenged, especially by the Magyars, right, that had also suffered during the war and were seeking, as we've seen, to restore the pre-Byzantine authority, acting as political seniors towards the Bosnians. It's well possible that just by the average international relations of the time, other rulers were acknowledging the Bosnian rule of Ban Kulin, such as the Pope. Here we're at the time of Alexander III, for example. And there would have been an important struggle, as we've seen, also between a Catholic power like the Magyars and an Orthodox one like the Byzantines regarding the Roman Catholic Church of Bosnia and all the issues deriving from this, right? Meanwhile, Bosnia would have kept an important connection with Adriatic centers like Dubrovnik. There would have still been the bridge, as we've seen with this broader Italian war that at this point was literally escalating and for unprecedented levels. We can imagine an involvement of the Bosnian market with Venetian trade, with the exports mostly from the Balkans to the Adriatic trade hub, and this would have all contributed to some important development of this power, and giving probably the material means for further development. All right. So this is essentially as you understand, quite difficult development and attempted visibility of something that can't look properly as a Bosnian polity. Here we are also mostly looking at through probably a Bosnian lens rather than focusing on the neighboring powers, but essentially, like as we've seen in the videos dedicated to those, there is a huge deal of indicators, like of also what kind of power would have actually existed in Bosnia at the time. And in fact, one of better, that could offer a broader understanding of the area. They're all similar histories. And for the specific region, a gradual development, something that takes form from also under the shade, let's say, or at least under the threatening shade of greater powers that, however, didn't quite manage to fully impose their direct rule over these lands. They were quite poor, so less profitable. There were other areas where to expand, but that still helped. As we've seen here, Bosnia had connections through other, by the way, mostly through the Serbian Adriatic polities, the same Western Europe. There was some influence in Carolingian times as well, right? But there is nothing sort of explicitly definitive about any other major sort of intervention, any other power in those places. Hungary later would be the catalyst force, as we've seen, also taking over Croatia that had first meddled into Bosnian affairs to enucleate the same Bosnia. And this is also the moment, as we've seen in other videos, in which the Serbs compact their own power. So there is, again, lots of interesting stuff going on, and we will see this really better in other videos. I'm, by the way, pleased to see that our Medieval Balkan playlist is really rising in importance. I don't know how many views it got, but it's probably quite watched. Yeah, over 1,100 views of the single playlist, not of the various videos that naturally collect, more or less the same amount of views. In some cases, even reaching 4,000 each. I mean, it's really impressive, but it sticks mostly to 1,100, 1,200, 1,300, something like that. People like that. I don't know whether it's because there are less videos on YouTube about this. For example, there is that playlist about medieval Romania that is receiving, I don't know how many, like 4,000 views or something like that. And I understand that it derives essentially from the fact that there isn't much out there. And or maybe, if you look at these nationalities, there is a greater sort of national issue in their recent history, in their relation with one another, as we were profiling also in this video. But there is also actually a lot of history to it. And it's not like this includes, as you know, the Byzantines. Medieval Balkans are dedicated probably to Balkan polities alone, right? And we're getting there in sort of, again, I've, of course, wanted to dedicate videos to this because I think that it really deserves it as a region and everything, but I realized that there is probably an enormous amount of stuff to tell, and we have to continue doing so. If anything, we have to increase as much as possible, especially this in-depth coverage from different regions, because this was a fortunate series that I actually stopped. I deleted the playlist of, meaning that the videos are always there, but you can't see this in a merely regional fashion. But for example, the playlist about the medieval Slavs in Eastern Europe is pretty intense. A lot of people watching this, and for reasons that, again, I have to further investigate, but have to do with, this is an old motive of Schwerpunkt. We always observe this, looking at the various comparisons and everything, but again, it's really important to, if anything, staying tuned and to appreciate all this inquiry, because that's at the end of the day what it gets down to, and we are glad to, if anything, cover the topics that less people tend to watch and browse. Even this video here is very much special in its own kind, right? I'm just curious. I want to see now how many people. I have the microphone in my hand now because you have no idea how I made this video for reasons of my fault, rather. But medieval Bosnia, for example, is there something? I'm using only one A. That's why I'm so slow. No, there is just a 6 months ago channel. How did Islam arrive in Bosnia? Oh my God! Yeah, crucial. Nobody knows how it arrived. Right? I think talking about medieval Bosnia is more interesting, and it's sort of just telling per se what this was all about from the beginning. I think it's much more interesting in a broader sense. Oh, damn, I hate bigger channels. They don't really say anything. They don't frame the most important historical topics. Either they don't talk about it, or they just properly don't give any kind of historical depth to that. It's just some kind of mechanistic, making people think as if there is the alchemic solution to this historical question. You have to study the history and simply being knowledgeable and having this open, sort of breathing landscape and vision, horizon on everything. Like those videos are pathetic. They tell you just how involved that the South historical mindset is, and this fuels this content does nothing but fueling it further that way. In any case, for today, I stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.